1987 was one of those major years for music, and it's a major year that I can remember. For the past 7 or 8 years, my friend Henrique Hopkins and I want to give a shout out to Henrique, as I do in most of these videos, have been talking a great deal in particular about the funk and soul genre, how there were so many rebirths in 1987. And, my boyfriend Scott Edwards and I, with our, trading repeats of vinyl and what we already have on CD, have also realized what a crucial year that was. And also, the deep thing about it is, it was a crucial stepping stone in pop and rock as well, but on a different level. It wasn't so much a rebirth as a trading over. Rock was exiting out of the new wave and new romantic influence of music and into what I suppose you might call the beginning of alternative, during 1987 in particular. And, the thing about 87 too is that was during a time where a lot of people, including in my family especially, were, switching over in terms of format from vinyl over to cassette tapes. And in a lot of cases, CDs. CD players were getting more common, more affordable. So, a lot of albums such as Kick by NXS and Prince's Sign of the Times and Bad, Michael Jackson, those kind of albums, I tend to have on CD more. I don't have a lot of them on vinyl. And the fact of the matter is, this collection of albums that I collected here for 1987 on vinyl, there's only a few scattershot biggies in terms of that year that were enormous and influential albums that I have on vinyl consequently. But I'm going to do something a little bit different in my tribute to 1987. I'm going to focus on a multitude of genres. Jazz, soul, dance, funk, rock, folk, a number of different singer-songwriter, a number of different genres, but this is basically what I have for vinyl from 1987, and I've made an effort not to repeat too much from other videos. There'll be a few, but I wanted to keep it in a situation where there were a lot of things maybe you hadn't seen, and one of them was an album I got Scott for his birthday this year, and I had a lot of trouble getting it. I had to order it offline, which I haven't done with vinyl for years, and I finally found it in my local record shop, Dr. Records, and it was actually a album that was sold by my friend Noah Natras. Wanted to thank him for selling this copy to Dr. Records so I could pick it up. This album, and this is one of those classics. This is U2's The Joshua Tree. And just in terms of this album's concept, let me open it up. There are U2. You have Bono, The Edge, Adam Clayton, and Larry Mullen Jr. at Joshua Tree State Park. I think my parents have actually visited there when they were visiting California. Now, this album, in a lot of ways, I would call this the beginning of the alternative era. It basically was where U2 found a balance between, a stripped-down, modern pop rock sound, and found out that a lot of American roots music, in particular country music, had Irish Celtic roots that, being an Irish band, they could actually relate to. So they mixed those two up and created this really rhythmic guitar playing sound in the early 80s from The Edge. And he really used it to great effect on this particular album. And it was produced, of course, by Daniel Lanois and Brian Eno. They're fantastic producers, and together, this is just an amazing record. Now, I don't think many pop and rock albums could ask for a greater opening than Where the Streets Have No Name, I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For, or With or Without You. I mean, those are the songs this album is most associated with, and it really exemplifies the sound I just told you about. But Scott and I were talking about another song on this album that really made an impact on me because it doesn't really sound like anything else here. And most of this album is pretty much in the mold of those first 3 cuts. But the one song that really gets to me, and I'm happy Scott mentioned it, was Bullet in the Blue Sky. Actually, Bullet the Blue Sky, I'm sorry. And now this is a song that has this really bluesy, country rock flavor. It's with a little surf element. It's kind of a little darker than most of the upbeat spiritual atmosphere of this entire album. But, it's really get a snaky quality that's different from the rest of this album. And, U2 had been really coming up in the world with this particular album. I'm going to take some things out of here to show you. The Joshua Tree had a custom label. There's a new Joshua Tree set out, which actually has some good things. And you know how I feel about some of the prices of some of these new vinyl. But the U2, if you're into U2, might actually have some good things on the new set. And I'm sure the sound is a lot better, actually. But this is the original album. I have this on CD, too. The cover is a little more compressed. On the CD, you don't get all that stuff. You just get the band members, of course. And it's a little blurrier, the cover. And here's the lyric sheet. The lyrics on this album are amazing. Okay, next up, we have an album that I just listened to the other night. George Benson, Earl Klugh collaboration. Not too long ago, I was at Bull Moose Books and Music, and movies, and they were playing a CD of this particular album. And Earl Klugh, and you see it on the cover. You have, of that time, of the 70s and 80s era, you have Earl Klugh, one of the top jazz fusion acoustic guitar players, and George Benson, who at that point really was hard to match on the electric. I mean, we had two virtuosos on two different types of guitars, and they both complement each other beautifully on this mostly instrumental album. George Benson does some of his scat playing and singing, and, I can't really pick highlights from this album because all of it just flows so beautifully. I know a lot of people call this smooth jazz, but it's like the David Sanborn collaboration album with Bob James that came out the year before this. The sax and keyboard sound that they put together. They did some great things on that too. I don't have that on vinyl. I have that on CD. And the opposite goes with this. I don't have this on CD. And I want to get this, though. It's a great album. You can just put this on all the way through and it just flows pretty well. Produced by the late Tommy LaPuma. And of course, the main thing that keeps this funky is you've got Greg Fillinganes, Harvey Mason playing the drums, Palento da Costa percussion, Paul Jackson rhythm guitar, and my man Marcus Miller on the bass. And that really chunkifies this particular production. It's a light, nice inner sleeve here. This album is just the standard Warner Brothers label of the time, so I'm not going to take that out. I remember, actually, several years after this album came out, when I was about 9 or 10, this had the first song I ever heard that alluded to, first pop song that alluded to the matter of child abuse, and that was Luca, My name is Luca, I live on the second floor. Susan Vega was a songwriter. This was actually her second album, I think her second album, either that or her third, but Susan Vega's music hit me a little later, and my boyfriend Scott gave this to me as a double from his collection. I don't actually have this on CD. My family have it on cassette, but this also has another historic number on it, and that's Tom's Diner. Now, it's an a cappella piece on this album. It was remixed a little bit later, but the piece as it stands was actually used to calibrate one of the first prototype MP3s. There was a documentary on PBS a little while ago that I get on Blu-ray that's brilliant, called Soundbreaking. If you're into music and music production and history and mixing them all together, you should really check that out. And talks all about Susan Vega and that song. So that's Solitude Standing. I want to give this album a listen because, in the 80s, in the late 80s, especially 87, the singer-songwriter thing, which hadn't really been big during the New Wave era, started to come back around. I mean, you had people like Amy Mann and Till Tuesday who kind of balanced out both worlds. And you still had people like Dan Fogelberg and James Taylor and, Bob Dylan, old veterans carrying on. But this was a new person coming out who was kind of going into that genre a little bit more. Got a lyric sheet on it. There's her band at the time. This is the A&M label. A&M, Herb Alpert's label actually put out a lot of great stuff. This is another thing that I got recently. I don't really have a lot of Miles Davis on vinyl. There's some things I definitely want to look for in Miles on vinyl, but this is a very special project. This is from a soundtrack from, I believe it's a French film called Siesta. Really interesting cover there. It's a movie starring Ellen Barkin, Gabriel Byrne, Julian Sands, Isabella Rossellini, Martin Sheen, Grace Jones is in it. It's got some really good people, but it's not something you can easily find on DVD these days. But the soundtrack, Henrique and I were talking about this, again, produced by the late Tommy LaPuma. And, of course, the main producer is Marcus Miller on this again. Go back to Marcus, major producer, musician, bassist. A lot of people at the time, as Henrique and I were talking about, in the press apparently, were comparing this to another Miles Davis album that was a classic of Miles. And it's something I don't actually have either, and I might get that on vinyl if I can find it, a good print of it. And that's his album Sketches of Spain, which he did with Gil Evans, whom this album is actually dedicated to. Gil was gone by this time. And it says the album is dedicated to Gil Evans, the master. Now, this album is Miles on trumpet, Marcus Miller doing all the other instruments, John Scofield playing an acoustic guitar, Earl Klugh appears on this, Omar Hakim, and Jason Walker and Jason Miles and some synthesizer programming. And even though this is a soundtrack, it is definitely like a modernized Sketches of Spain. There's a lot of flamenco and Spanish influences. It reminds me of what one of jazz's founding fathers, Jelly Roll Morton, said about jazz. He used to add habanero dance rhythms to his music, and he said that's the Spanish tinge, and that's the right seasoning for jazz, and that really brings it out. Miles loved that Spanish tinge in his music, always. This is again on Warner Brothers, Miles' label at the time. Just a regular Warner Brothers label. This is in really good shape. I don't see this album on vinyl around much too often. Actually, this is, I think, the second time I actually saw it, and I decided to pick it up. But it's really common on CD. If you can find it on CD or a tape or vinyl, pick it up. If you love Miles Davis, it's really a worthy album of his, and especially the soundtrack. And if you love Marcus Miller and Miles, goes without saying, because this is one of their greatest works together. I remember 10,000 Maniacs and the In My Tribe album from my father having it on tape. We used to do a mock radio show called WNE Pork. It had a loose pig theme. I think I mentioned it before. And the great thing about that was we could premiere some new songs. And one of them was a song by this group called Like the Weather, which I really liked. It was a kind of pop rock song with a little mild ska, kind of slight Caribbean flavor to it. And Natalie Merchant has such a unique voice, and this was at the time, and this is again part of that singer-songwriter boom that Suzanne Vega was coming out with at the time. And the reason I got this album on vinyl is because it's in really good shape. Produced by Peter Asher, who got James Taylor started out in the early days. It has a cover of Cat Stevens' Peace Train. When the whole Salman Rushdie controversy came up in the late 80s, that song was removed from this album, probably by the record company. I'm not too sure about it. But I hear that it's kind of difficult to find this album with Peace Train on it, but I'm glad I found this first pressing of the album. It's just the Elektra label, so I don't need to show you that. Again, repeat from Scott. He actually had this album 3 times. One for himself, one for me, and one for his friend Keith. Now, this was an album that came out in 87, and it's actually the greatest hits till 87, from 79 to 87. Easy enough to find on CD, not really needed now with all the Elton John compilations. By the way, I wanted to give a shout out to anybody watching this who attended the recent Elton John shows in Bangor and Portland. I'm sorry I didn't make the Bangor one. I hear it was really great. But anyway, this is Elton's 80s period, primarily. So, if you look at the back, I think I've showed you this before. You've got, I guess that's why they call it the blues, Little Genie, Sad Song, Say So Much, Empty Garden, Too Low for Zero, Blue Eyes, Nikita. This is a little early for I Don't Want to Go On With You Like That, or any of his other songs from later. So, this is a Record Club release, by the way. And actually, there's a poster that doesn't belong in here, but that's going to be from another story. This is an album by a group called the Blow Monkeys. I had a 45 of theirs that I really enjoyed from hearing it on the radio when I was little, called Digging Your Scene. And this is their album from 1987. And the title of the album is, again, it's not one of those titles listed on the cover. It's She Was Only a Grocer's Daughter. There's the group right there. This album doesn't actually have any thing on the inside. It's just an RCA Victor label. No big deal. Torch Song, Exhibit A. This is again a repeat from the collection of Scott Edwards. This is a collection of songs with William Orbit, the producer who later would do Madonna's album Ray of Light. Great dance album from that era on the IRS label. Fatburger, Good News. They were a mid-80s, Yellow Jackets / Spyro Gyra / Ripping Tins, late fusion, proto-smooth jazz group. And I believe this is their first album, but I first heard about them from a cover featuring this kid holding this giant hamburger. And, that name seemed to be very appropriate. And the title song of that album from the early 2000s was a cover of the Isley Brothers song Work to Do. So I figured this is from 87. This is much earlier in their career, so I picked this up. It's on a label that I've never actually heard of. Intima Records. It has all these really interesting references to the label's apparently small catalog. It looks like Alan Holdsworth's A Tabacron album, which I had on vinyl, was on that label. And his album, Alan Holdsworth, apparently was on this label. Nobody else I've ever heard of course. Richard Elliott apparently had a song, an album on this label. So there's a lot of interesting things to read if you get this vinyl with all the original stuff. It looks like there's more going on than meets the eye there. Now this is, of course, I think Peter Wolf's, I believe his second solo album. After I suppose the breakup, really, of the Jay Giles band in the early 80s. Now this particular album apparently has a more rockier edge than his first one. I haven't listened to it yet, so I really have no way of knowing. It's on EMI. It's got the original insides, inserts. Let me see if it has a custom. No, just regular EMI. I got this at a place called Central Maine Antiques, and they have some sealed albums. And I got a bunch of Kevin Eubanks albums that were sealed, and they're on GRP, Digital Master. These were actually meant to be heard on CD. You know, Kevin Eubanks, of course, known for the David Letterman band and everything. But the thing is, Kevin Eubanks did some amazing fusion records that actually led more into the heavy jazz end of it. This is sealed. I intend to open it up. It's a cutout. But I intend to open this up and listen to it. You know, a lot of people I know out here, they don't like to open seal albums. But, again, these are not showpieces to me. I listen to these. So this will be opened, just to let you know. Ruben Blades. Assis de Solar, I think that's how it's pronounced. I probably have the same French accent when trying to pronounce Spanish words that my mother does, because I don't know either language at all. But I know who Ruben Blades is. You know, he had a music career in the Latin world. You know, before Latin music really broke out in the late 80s and early 90s. And I know him mostly by appearing as the paramour of Lynn Whitfield's Josephine Baker in the 1991 biopic from HBO, The Josephine Baker Story. I really look forward to hearing this album. It's on Elektra. There's his group at the time. There's some lyrics. Of course, it's all in Spanish, so I won't understand any of it. This is an album I actually have on CD, and it's a double from Scott's collection, Bright Lights, Big City. And, of course, there are two major songs on this that really got my attention. That was Prince, Good Love, which is one of his many unreleased songs, and Donald Fagen's Century's End, which I know quite well from my mother and father playing it a lot. Just on Warner Brothers label. It's no big deal. Okay, DeBarge, Bad Boys. This is basically what remained of DeBarge by '87 after Earl and Bunny departed. I had only heard of that album. It's an odd album that the lyrics are just printed on the back like this. And they aren't even on Motown anymore. They're on a label called Stripped Horse. You know, I somehow don't think DeBarge were doing that fantastic when this album was released, or now that El DeBarge was gone, there was anybody really caring too much about, you know, what they were going to do. So they were on a little label, kind of a budgety looking label, but this is their 1987 return album. I haven't really seen it anywhere else. Now, I intended to do a Beatles solo video in the future, and I still am, which will include this album. And the history behind this was in 1987. You know, Paul McCartney wasn't touring, he wasn't doing a lot of studio recordings, but he recorded a Live in the Studio collection of rock oldies, specifically to be released in Russia, as you can see from this writing. It was later released in America, and it's called Choba BCCCP. It's on his MPL label, and as you can see, this is an import because it's kind of got a flimsy case. I think this is actually a Soviet album. The writing's all Russian. Yeah, this is definitely a Russian import album. I don't want to make anybody too upset, but I actually got this in a dollar bin. Probably a person had it on CD, you know, had it. I mean, now back when this was released, it was still in the days of the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain, and this was probably at the time super mega hugely rare in this country. I don't know how it is now, but I'm pretty happy I have a copy of this. I really look forward to listening to that. You know, I love me some McCartney. Kid Creole and the Coconuts, another person that I'm really into. It's got one of those Give the Gift of Music. I used to see a lot of those at Christmas time. They were really at a peak in the mid-'80s to me, this band. The Sire label of the time. Very underrated group. Check them out, definitely. And here we have the Christians. Now, they're another double I got from Scott. Laura Branigan, her 1987 album Touch. I've already reviewed this in my Laura Branigan video, but really good album from her. Jermaine Stewart, the late Jermaine Stewart. I believe this was one of his last albums. Produced with Andre Simone and Jerry Knight from Ray Parker Jr. and Radio. This is on the Arista label. It's the 10th anniversary. There's an insert. There's Jermaine. Yep, it's got the Arista. He's got the 10th anniversary logo. Next up, we have Joycelyn Brown. I'd heard vaguely of her for a while, but I'm really happy I found this album. It's got a lyrics sheet. It's got a little imprint from the Jelly Bean subsidiary. Jelly Bean Benitez, who helped produce Madonna in the early days and had a solo career around that time, actually helped produce that album. And there's what I have, most of which you probably haven't seen, from 1987. Now, I haven't heard all these albums, obviously, yet. vinyl or otherwise, but and I know that, like I said, I don't have In Excess's Kick or Sign All the Time from Prince or Michael Jackson's Bad or anything like that, or even Herb Albert's Keep an Eye on Me. These are albums that I have on CD. I may get them on vinyl eventually, but this is what I have, and there's some really unique things in here. So I wanted to pay tribute to 30 years ago. It's hard to believe I was 7 and just getting into music in '87 in a big way. My first turntable, Sirius 45s, that point. So that began my musical mission as time went on. It varied in interest over time. There were other things that peaked with me, but '87 was the year that really started. Now, there's another year that's celebrating its 40th anniversary that I wasn't around for, but I'm going to get to that at another time. So for those of you who remember '87 and remember the music of '87 fondly, I hope you enjoyed this video. Peace.